a song of joy, a grateful hymn of praise, and let his glory fill the earth, let every voice be raised. Oh, sing unto the Lord, let the earth respond, his awesome deeds proclaim. Declare his words to everyone, and praise his holy name. All oceans, hills, and trees reply,
let his praise be lifted high.
let the valleys now be raised, and every mountain shout his awesome praise. Come sing unto the Lord, let the song go forth, all nations join and sing.
Find God's will and do it. This has been the philosophy of Fairhaven Baptist Church for over 40 years. Dr. Roger Vogelin learned this lesson as a young man who fought the call to preach until his early 20s. When he finally gave over his will to do God's will, he resolved to always find God's will and then do it. Once he surrendered to preach, his pastor, Dr. Bill Schroeder, sent him off to attend Bible college. After attending for a year, he and Sharon Binkley were married, and as he neared graduation, he served as pastor of a small church in the Sand Hills of South Carolina. After graduation, Pastor Vogelin was a youth pastor and interim pastor in Pennsylvania for about 13 months. While leading that church to find their next pastor, God showed him that he wanted him to pastor a church, and particularly to start a church. After much prayer, preacher called his own pastor and asked him if he knew of anyone who wanted to start a church or had a smaller church that needed a pastor. Preacher was going to be traveling through the Chicago area with a teen group a few days from then, so Dr. Schroeder suggested, let's have breakfast. A short while after preacher's call, a man named Jerry Rainier called Dr. Schroeder and asked him if he knew of anyone who wanted to start a church in Chesterton, Indiana. Again, Dr. Schroeder said, let's have breakfast. And the three met in August of 1970. Roger and Sharon Vogelin both grew up in Chicago, so the neighborhood they envisioned working in was much bigger than Chesterton, Indiana in 1970. When they visited the town, it was much smaller than it is today. No 4-lane state highway, no 6-lane interstate, and just one blinking light at the intersection of Calumet and Broadway. Preacher really hated the idea of starting a church in a small town, but as he prayed, he could not get away from God's will. Finally, he surrendered, and before he could change his mind, literally fell down the stairs from the upstairs bedroom where he normally prayed in this house in order to call Jerry and commit to doing what he knew God wanted. It was then, in September of 1970, that Preacher and Sharon left Pennsylvania. Jerry and a couple other guys had $500 in the bank, and they gave it to the Vogelins to help with moving expenses. Sharon was expecting Jeff at the time. Their car was a new 1970 Plymouth Duster, just like one every respectable pastor would have, of course. When the Vogelins arrived in Chesterton, they rented a house on Sidewalk Road for $100 a month. The house has since been torn down. Where it stood is now part of the Coffee Creek Watershed Preserve. After a month or so, the church rented a small room at the Sandpiper Restaurant, which is now the Moose Lodge. Originally, the church was to have use of a large room with an organ, but another pastor claimed it. Instead, they got a small room where they used a toy organ for the music and a Does laundry soap box for a pulpit. After hours and hours of passing out brochures for the new church, many made professions, but few came to the services. When people did come to the services, they stopped attending once they heard the preaching against drinking and for separation from a worldly lifestyle. For a time, attendance reached only 11 to 13 people, and the only family in regular attendance was the Rainiers. It was around this time that Pastor Vogelin was asked to attend a conservative political meeting in the area at which Dr. Stuart Crane was speaking. Dr. Crane was a relatively young Christian, but after the morning session, he pulled out his King James Bible and started preaching. The 200 adults in attendance liked his message and were even clapping. Preacher had the idea that if he could get Dr. Crane to speak at the church, the conservatives who had attended that meeting might come out to hear him again. Maybe if they heard the gospel, some would get saved. While preacher really wanted Dr. Crane to come speak, the church was struggling financially. They had started on pure faith, without support from other ministries and no secular job to supplement any of the finances. Miraculously, God had provided their needs each week. But to take on the expense of a guest speaker seemed like too much. Preacher wrote Dr. Crane, asking him to come at some time in the future. Dr. Crane called preacher immediately upon receiving the letter and said he could come right away, on Christmas Day. He said he would fly his own plane, and with a daily stipend, his trip would only cost the church $600. $600 was a lot of money in 1970, and to a struggling 2-month-old church, that seemed impossible. Preacher told Dr. Crane he would pray about it. Of course, there was no way the church could afford to have him come in such a short time. But Sharon kindly reminded him that he said he would pray about it. And when he did, preacher clearly understood that God wanted him to have Dr. Crane come to speak. He came on Christmas night. The church rented the American Legion Hall to accommodate the number of people they hoped would come. They had to clean up the beer cans in the hall left over from the Legion's Christmas Eve party. Over 100 people came to that meeting on Christmas night. Another 100 attended a second meeting the following day, and 67 were at church the next morning for Sunday services. Even with the extra space, more chairs had to be set up to accommodate the crowd. These meetings and that Sunday was really the beginning of the church. People were saved, and afterward the church flourished, jumping from a few to about 40 people. But at the close of these services, there was still the problem of paying Dr. Crane. Those who attended the meetings had given an offering of exactly $600. So after paying the speaker, there wasn't anything left to pay the weekly rent for the Sandpiper restaurant that was due the next day. $27 a week for rent seems like almost nothing now. But back then, it had to be prayed in and paid by faith every single week. Up until that time, God had provided it every week. But now it looked as if the last of the church's money was going into the speaker's pocket. However, God knew the church's needs and proved himself faithful once again. When the preacher shook hands with Dr. Crane to say goodbye, he felt some money slip into his hand. Dr. Crane explained that his expenses weren't as much as he had expected. Preacher hurried back to his car and looked to see how much money he had been given. It was exactly $27. Truly, God was good. The church began to thrive. God was blessing. However, the Sandpiper restaurant where they had been meeting closed. God led through this seeming dead end to an opportunity to buy a piece of property. A small house on 8 acres of land was available on the corner of Oak Hill Road and State Route 49 for $30,000. The church members sacrificed to purchase this land, some even securing second mortgages on their houses or taking out loans on insurance policies. Once the property was bought, the house was prepared as a meeting place for the church. Preacher and his family lived upstairs, which was also used for Sunday school classes and a nursery. The basement became the church auditorium. Part of the basement was dug out to accommodate a furnace and a hot water tank so that the meeting room could be made bigger. A separate, wide entrance to the basement was built. Everything was done so as to be as professional as possible. The work to make the house into a meeting place for a church was extensive, but worth it, even though the church would only meet there for a short time. The men of the church did much of the work, such as a much younger John Hall, who put in the sump pump. While the remodeling went in, the church met at the Coronado Lodge for about 8 months. During that summer of 1971, revival services were held in a tent on the Oak Hill property. It was a great success. Over 160 people attended the Wednesday night service. The only problem was the mud. The construction on the 49 bypass was underway, so when it rained, the path down the hill to the tent was like ice. And then there were the mosquitoes. The services ended promptly at 9 p.m. Someone had donated a piano to the church, but it was impossible to get it out of their house. So preacher cut off the legs and moved the piano and then nailed the legs back on. A quick coat of paint, and no one seemed to notice. The church's first anniversary was held in this basement auditorium with about 80 in attendance. That fall, after the anniversary, construction on the first church building began. In every step, God proved He was with the church, obtaining financing, finding a builder, even the placement of the foundation, which was laid out by flashlight late one evening. God directed it all. And God was protecting the church as well. Preacher tells about looking out the window of the house one morning and seeing someone giving the foreman of the construction crew a hard time. When he went out to investigate, he overheard a union representative badgering the non-union foreman of Hamster Builders. The rep was making not-so-veiled threats that perhaps the wind could come blow the walls down, or an accidental fire could destroy the whole project. Preacher spoke up and told the man that yes, the wind could blow and a fire could start. But with his house overlooking the site, if he saw any people down there, he'd blow them away with his shotgun. Thankfully, the union didn't cause any problems after that, especially since preacher didn't even own a shotgun at the time. The building was finished just in time for school to start, literally the night before. It was 1972. The new auditorium seated about 200. At the dedication of the building, however, 200 seats weren't enough. Over 400 people crowded in, even spilling out into the hallway. God was working as He had from the very beginning. God was also working in the foundation of Fairhaven Baptist Academy. Miss McCauley, whom most would recognize as Mrs. McDonald, was one of the school's first teachers. The classes were not as fancy as those of the public schools, but they were sharp. At least the rooms were. But students, like a much littler John Hall Jr., needed a lot of work and prayer. The Cubby hole kitchen was situated behind the auditorium, allowing it to be easily transformed into a fellowship hall when needed. This area is now the new nursery. During the construction of that first building, Forrest Wells, the president of Midwest Steel and chairman of the board of National Steel, went to preacher for counseling. He claimed to be a Christian, but realized he was losing his family. He needed guidance. Preacher advised him to resign his position and move back to Maryland to be with his family. To his surprise, the man did just that, and he asked the church to buy his property for a very low cost of $100,000. The land in question was 32 acres, including a 20-acre man-made lake, a small swimming pool, a tennis court, and a house befitting a president of a steel mill. Overwhelmed, preacher told him it just couldn't be done. The man's reply was, "What about that big God you've been telling me about? What about praying?" So preacher prayed, and God gave him an answer. Before long, the church was in possession of the property on a land contract of $500 a month. They used the house as an apartment for the single teachers working in the academy. This brought the church property to a total of 40 acres. Preacher didn't know it then, but God had plans for that property. Before Mr. Wells sold his property to the church, he had sold the sand on the property for the construction of the Highway 49 and I-94 overpass. While digging, the crew hit an underground spring, but continued digging. After their work was completed, the lake slowly began to fill up. The church initially planned a beach on the lake, but wasn't successful. Instead, near the present location of the Goss's house, the men built a slide out of sheet metal. Anyone venturing down that slide would find himself being cut and sliced by that metal. It didn't take long for people to simply stop swimming in the lake. Those early days weren't all work, however. The church held youth activities at the new house. The chief chef grilled steaks by the pool. The town's 4th of July parade saw the first Fairhaven float. Of course, everything had to be done in a big way. Camp Fairhaven started in the summer of 1973. A faithful church member, Ed Weimer, gave the church a speedboat, and hours were spent water skiing around that little lake. It was also in 1973 that the church bought its first bus. The first route was in Portage, and with the bus route came the bus promotions. Preacher held a contest with another pastor in Valparaiso and obviously lost. The balloon launch was a fun way to reach people from places near and far. The church put tracks in all the balloons and gave a prize to the person whose balloon went the farthest. Letters came from faraway states in response. In those early years, many great men of God spoke at revivals and special meetings, including Bob Jones, Jr. Pastor Vogeland had met Dr. Phil Schuler in Pennsylvania and, knowing he had a heart for small churches, later asked him to come to Indiana for a revival. The meetings were a great success, and he continued to speak at the church until he died just a few years ago. Dr. Schuler was always a special blessing to the church. By this time, the church was growing so rapidly that once the first building was dedicated, a second building was started. This small gymnasium was used for the school and church services and is now the college chapel. The first stewardship banquet was held in this gym. A lot of hard work was being done on the grounds of the still new church, but more importantly, people were being reached for Christ. The school was growing quickly. Enrollment went from 100 to 300 in the first couple years. It was an exciting time in the growth of Fairhaven Baptist Church. Along with God's blessings, preacher knew God was leading him to expand. To do so, the house the church originally met in had to be moved. This house, which is the O'Hare's now, would have to be moved again years later to make room for our gym library building. Early in 1974, the bank promised to give a loan in the fall for a new auditorium. But the builders wanted to start before that time, while the price of steel was at an all-time low. So by faith, the exterior of a new auditorium began to take shape. And then, from a human perspective, the bottom seemed to fall out. Mrs. Chrisman, along with her 3 children, had been attending Fairhaven. 2 of the children, ages 11 and 13, were enrolled in the school already and loved it. But when the academy expanded to high school in the fall of 1974, 15-year-old Kenny did not want to attend. Mr. Chrisman had been an alcoholic and, due to complications from a bar fight, died that summer. But on his deathbed, he had made a profession of faith and, knowing he was dying, asked that Kenny be able to attend the academy that fall. When it came time for Kenny to start, however, he ran away. He had been hearing speeches in his public school by a child advocate and seeing posters at school that said, "If you have problems at home, come to the child advocate." Under the guise of helping children, the National Child Advocacy Program was being tested in northwest Indiana. And when Kenny ran to the child advocate, he was told that he didn't have to do what his parents said. Pastor Vogeland and Mrs. Chrisman met with the authorities, but they refused to let Kenny come home, going so far as to say that if they did let him come home, Mrs. Chrisman would not be allowed to mention God in Kenny's presence. During the meeting, the police officer present told preacher that if he ever spanked his son, even with just a 12-inch ruler, and his son was old enough to dial the phone and call him as the child advocate, the boy would be out of his house by that evening. This type of government intrusion into the home was unheard of in 1974, and preacher went to the juvenile judge of Porter County, Alfred Pavarnik, to let him know what was happening. The judge said he couldn't listen to what preacher had to say because he might have to hear the case and would then be prejudiced and not be able to make a fair judgment. Preacher didn't know at the time that Pavarnik was the one in charge of the child advocacy program. In the midst of this upheaval, Preacher went to a lawyer who had previously worked on matters concerning the church buildings and land, and when the lawyer heard about the situation, he was angry. However, after looking into it, he advised, "Stay away. I won't be your lawyer if you pursue this." Getting no help from any authorities, Preacher took out ads in local newspapers. Child stolen by welfare. The Portage Police Department, the Porter County Welfare Department, and of course, the area juvenile judge, Alfred Pavarnik, were incensed. A grand jury was convened. Preacher thought to investigate the claims made by these ads. Mrs. Chrisman and Preacher went to the courthouse ready to testify, but were told that they were not needed. It wasn't until later they realized that the grand jury was really just a tool of the prosecutor, and when the grand jury was finished, the police arrested Preacher and Mr. Yingling, the academy principal. It was apparent that the authorities expected them to make bail and go home, but they were too naive to do so. Without a lawyer, they spent 4 nights in jail. But God was still leading. Before being picked up, Preacher had been given a 5-minute warning. He called his assistant pastor and asked him to call a few of the leaders in fundamentalism to spread the word. He also asked him to call the church members and academy parents to come to the jail in Valparaiso with the lights of their cars blinking. He asked him to call media outlets, and although it was late at night, by the time all the people got there, the news media was there too. The line of cars that made the drive from Chesterton to Valparaiso was extremely long. The sheriff thought it was long too. People crammed into the lobby of the jail and crowded together on the steps of the jailhouse and into the street. Preacher still remembers the sheriff saying, "You must have a large congregation. Why don't you tell them to go home?" Unbeknownst to Preacher, the sheriff had already tried to disperse the crowd, but many in the crowd echoed Ed Weimer's words, "This is my jailhouse. I paid for it, and I'm staying." The jail was brand new, but Preacher and Mr. Yingling had been put in the women's section, separated from each other and from everyone else. They were discouraged, to say the least. They had not heard of a pastor being put in jail. It just wasn't done. There were battles being fought, but not jail. And when the deputy closed that door, it was frightening. But then, about 10:30 at night, the people of the church surrounded the jail and began singing. Preacher couldn't see out the window of his cell, but he remembers jumping up, trying to wave. What an encouragement to these 2 men to hear the crowd singing, "Onward, Christian soldiers." Preachers often said they wanted to knock us down, but they actually put us on a pedestal. On the way to the courthouse to be arraigned, reporters crowded around Preacher and with cameras rolling took notes on what had happened. The Today Show, the only morning news program at the time, wanted Preacher to interview live in New York, but the court ordered his bail such that he could not leave the state. That morning saw so many people around the courthouse that the whole square was covered. Preacher was charged with conspiracy to commit a felony, aggravated assault, and battery. He hadn't spanked anybody, but he was charged because he wrote the handbook that said the academy believed in spanking as discipline. In addition, there were 2 charges for criminal libel in reference to the ads that had been placed in the paper. Preacher and the principal were then freed on bond. Lester Roloff and his lawyers came up from Corpus Christi to help. It soon became clear, though, that the lawyers were simply there for the money. They charged $40,000 before they even stood before a judge. Roloff, of course, was a great man, but his lawyers weren't. In the months before the trial, many secular people came to the aid of the church simply because they recognized the corruption in the situation. One such organization was the Northwest Indiana Crime Commission, which had been in business for 50 years. But after coming to Preacher's defense, they were disbanded. Elmer Jacobson, the head of this organization, was saved through the testimony of Preacher and the other church members. Another lawyer from nearby Hammond, Owen Crumpacker, stood with the church during the case. Though he was a very prominent, respected attorney, he was disbarred as well. Shortly before the trial, Preacher came in contact with Jim Tesouris. Compared to the lawyers preacher had dealt with so far, Thesaurus was a bulldog. The trial began on Monday, May 12, 1975. The evidence brought against them was silly. For example, our halls were too quiet, and the school snuck religion in on the kids. The academy practiced spanking, but that wasn't even against the law, and there was no evidence of any child being injured. On Thursday of that week, the prosecution rested their case. The judge then gave a directed verdict, something preacher didn't even understand at the time. This was the first time it had been used in the county in 25 years. The judge, Bruce Douglas, stated that the prosecution didn't have one iota of evidence and dismissed the charges against preacher. The academy principal was found innocent by the jury the next day, Friday, May 16th. Debbie was born on Sunday, May 18th. It was a happy time for the Vogelins, knowing that through all this attack, God had delivered his people. The whole process, however, had been steeped in corruption. Judge Douglas and Jim Thesaurus put their reputations and careers at stake for their roles. Thesaurus always said that it was only God who won the case, and after the ruling, the powers that be still tried to disbar Douglas. After the ordeal was over, the church found itself in poor financial straits. Though Jim Thesaurus had only charged $5,000 for his services, the church still owed the attorneys who were consulted previously. Academy attendance was down by more than 100. Attendance on the buses dwindled to almost nothing. The bank had reneged on its promise to grant the loan for the building of the new auditorium. Even though they had won the court case, the church felt defeated. But with God's help, they determined to keep going. That year, the church's theme was building and battling. The people of the church knocked on 50,000 doors, going back to those doors until someone answered. Preacher encouraged them with, "You reap what you sow." But all those visits only resulted in 2 professions of faith and no visitors to the services. But God was about to open the windows of heaven. The next few months saw tremendous victory, including God's provision of the money for the new auditorium. The church exploded in the year after the court case. Attendance went from a depleted 200 to 1,100, then on to 1,600 and 2,000. The church purchased a new youth bus. The small gym was expanded to handle the crowds. The junior church was so full it literally looked like a sea of faces. Evangelist Dean Blakeney wowed kids and adults alike with his karate demonstrations, even dicing a watermelon on someone's belly in the gym. Judge Pavarnik openly bragged that he was going to bleed the church to death. But even though he did sue the church 2 years after the court case, God again delivered his people. A member of another church who owned several airplanes had heard of the church's struggle during the court case and gave preacher the use of a plane and a pilot whenever he needed to travel across the country, speaking to other churches about his experience and warning Christians of the direction America was heading. The new auditorium had to be used even before the interior was completed. Junior church classes were held in the unfinished foyer. Fairhaven was Indiana's fastest-growing Sunday school the year before the court battle and for the 3 years following. The church was growing so quickly, preacher was afraid the building wouldn't be able to handle the weight of the crowds. The auditorium was dedicated in September of 1976. The finishing touches were, once again, completed in the late hours just before the service. The paint was still wet the day of the dedication. Ray Hart was present, singing at that meaningful service. In 7 years, God had taken the church from the corner of a restaurant to the basement of a house to a 40-acre complex, from 1 family to 2,000 people. God was showing himself real, not only to those who had remained faithful during the hard times, but to the world that had scoffed and mocked during the trial. Around this time, many of the churchmen who worked for the local steel mills were out of work. So they used their extra time to expand the pool. Faithful men like Tom Haiti and Bill Ramus worked alongside preacher. Bill helping out long before he was even saved. The Academy wrestling program was very successful as well. Youngsters like Todd Wright were learning more than how to pin their opponents. They were learning character. Another character-building method that has become a trademark of Fairhaven life is the cross-country race. Even kindergarten-age Debbie Whitaker ran the lake with her dad. Preacher saw the need to instill character into the young people of the academy. He also began to see the need for a college to train men and women for the ministry. Fairhaven Baptist College was started in 1977 with 13 students. This led to the next major building project, a college wing. As in the past, the project, located where the dining hall sits presently, was racing the clock. Classes were scheduled to begin in a few weeks when a severe rainstorm caused an unsupported wall to cave in. With only 6 weeks to work, the building was miraculously finished, even if a few new college freshmen were recruited to help. The 10th anniversary of the church was an exciting time. The theme was 10 years of victory. The church had been through tremendous battles and victories in a relatively short time. Still, attendance averaged 2,000 each Sunday morning. The church gave Preacher and Mrs. Vogelin a vacation to St. Thomas and presented him with another very pastoral vehicle, a Datsun 280Z painted British racing green. Attendance for that 10th anniversary was somewhere around 5,600, but more importantly, souls were being saved by the hundreds. Then, as now, many politicians and government officials were invited to hear the gospel on political day. Just like wrestling and cross-country, work became a defining characteristic of Fairhaven. Yet another building project saw the other side of the classroom building completed. As in the past, the interior work was done by the men of the church. In 1984, the ladies' dormitory was finished and dedicated to the service of the Lord in memory of Harriet Anderson, a godly, soul-conscious wife who had died of cancer at a fairly young age. At the same time the dorm was being completed, the fountain, now demolished, was completed. After the new college wing was finished, renovations were made to the original college wing, transforming classrooms and a student lounge into a library. Then, in 1987, the men's dormitory was built. R.L. Grant Construction did the exterior work for the project. The finished dorm was a first-class building where young men could learn to serve God but still feel at home. During this period of building, the town asked the church to tie on to their water and sewer. It was a massive project to run that line and a big battle. The town had asked the church to come on their system. They had too much water. They saw an opportunity to make some money by supplying the church complex. But when the work was complete and the church was ready to hook on, the town, with no explanation, refused. The town board fought the process, saying the college boys could just live on the street. Eventually, after years of battling over the issue, Jim Tesaurus advised the preacher to just hook on and they won't do anything about it. Preacher did, and they didn't. The church simply metered the usage and paid for it. After the buildings were completed, the church worked to make the grounds more presentable. The landscaping and gazebo added to the beauty of the church property. The church and college campus was by then 72 acres, a true testament to God's blessing. The work ethic that was necessary to see all this brought about, the academy and college buildings, the dormitories, the lake road, even the water hookup, is still a defining characteristic of Fairhaven. God had truly blessed the dedication and faithfulness of Fairhaven Baptist Church. Each anniversary saw another year to celebrate God's goodness, and the church celebrated with cake. One particular cake was made in the shape of the church's buildings. In the academy, the wrestling program continued to do well. For over 4 years, the team went to all the Christian school tournaments and never lost any tournament or dual meet. Most of us were slimmer back then, even Dr. Vogelin, pinning a wrestler from the Hammond Baptist team. The church's influence began to reach beyond its own community. On political days, politicians and government officials came from across the state for a special brunch in the men's dormitory. By 1990, the old gymnasium could barely contain the crowd at the stewardship banquet and other activities. Fairhaven is an old-fashioned Bible-believing church. To celebrate that, the church has often held special anniversary services as Old-Fashioned Day, with dinner on the grounds, members all dressed up, old-time games, Ray McDonald's hay rides, and antiques all around. Even camel rides. Sunday evening inside the big tent included the Hallelujah offering. Over the years, this old-fashioned day has been a time of great joy and fellowship for God's people. Dr. Phil Schuler was a favorite guest speaker of those days. By the church's 30th anniversary, the financial situation of the church had stabilized. The debt on the buildings had been paid. All notes, bonds, and loans were paid off. The church celebrated with a brand new travel bus, paid for in cash. And once again, a building project ensued. The auditorium was rebuilt without any loan. In order to utilize as much of the old building as possible, the walls were pushed out, making room for the wings. The intricate woodwork and traditional architecture reflect a heritage of early American churches. And once again, the people of the church worked on the project themselves. People like Barry Hughes, breaking out concrete where the old ramps used to be. Lyle Geist, minus a few pounds. Todd and Tony Wright with Pastor Whitaker. Dave Olson, playing in the mud. And Bonnie Ford wallpapering up on scaffolding. The building began to take shape, and today there isn't a more striking auditorium across fundamentalism. In 2005, the recreation building was completed. Hamster builders once again did remarkable work in their construction of this multi-purpose structure. The building was completed with modern techniques. The track is literally hung from the ceiling of the structure. The indoor swimming pool is deeper on each end, allowing for competitive swimming. The beautiful two-level library is both striking and comfortable. Hamster's oversight of the recreational building allowed the men of the church to focus on the remodeling of the classroom building. Both wings were enclosed and enlarged. The most economical method was to build a new exterior right over the old building. Everything inside was reused. Even the insulation from the original structure helps keep the cost of heating and cooling the new building lower. Work on the HVAC system on top of the old building is literally still underway. As Greg Goss has said, we do 3 pipes per week, whether we need to or not. The complex system of water lines from the chiller system and boilers in the mechanical building supplies the heating and cooling from that one building to the entire school and auditorium complex. The completion of these projects allowed for the focus to be shifted once again to the grounds. The outdoor pool was dug up. The old fountain was torn down and replaced with landscaping and a new walkway. The lake fountain was also installed. The old dining hall was converted to the Jolly 60s room. The old gym was converted to a beautiful college chapel and offices. The church was blessed to obtain a professional printing press from Dr. Wilbert Unger of London, Ontario, whose church currently prints for Way of Life literature. Most recently, a new horse riding arena and picnic shelter were constructed. Various playgrounds were recently added, and both dormitories refaced. All of these additions have only added to the church's outreach ministries. After all these years, Fairhaven Baptist Church has much to be thankful for. God has blessed this church in ways Preacher and Mrs. Vogelin never imagined in that fall of 1970. One evidence of God's mighty work is the vast number of graduates who represent those years of faithful service. Through the years, many of Fairhaven's own young people, in addition to hundreds of other college students, have gone out to serve the Lord across America and around the world. Several work on staff here at Fairhaven right now. At the 30th anniversary of the college, the alumni presented the school with a special monument stone that is inscribed with the fundamental philosophy underlying all these blessings. Find God's will and do it.